Hi, I'm Jake Dalzell and I'm here at Killard Point National Nature Reserve with Ana McCrea to look at the really nice grassland and the plants growing in it, and also some of the things that are growing on those plants.
Is there anything in particular you want to find today? Or new things or old things that you've seen before?
I think a really nice thing to find here would be autumn lady's tresses, although I already know where it is, because this is the only site in Ulster for it, and until quite recently it was only thought to occur in Dublin and further south on the east coast of Ireland until last year when me and my mum came here and we found it here, which was a big surprise because this is quite a well studied site, and to find like a pretty big population of quite distinctive looking orchid, you would have thought someone would have noticed it before, but I guess not. I think the reason for that is that they recently changed the grazing regime here. So they changed the time that they put the cattle on, and that's probably benefited plants. So
Time of year?
Yeah. So autumn lady's tresses can persist for decades and decades without flowering. So probably the change to a better grazing regime caused it all to flower at once, and now it flowers. It flowered last year and it flowered this year, maybe around 100 plants.
Yeah, that'll be cool to see because I remember seeing it in the news and everything.
Yeah.
Seeing you post about it, and my mom was sending me like, look what Judith found and all this. Or actually, she said, Jake, you took the credit.
No, well, I tried to give my mum the credit, and then no one publishing the story seemed to give her any credit, which was a shame.
They have to give the student all the credit.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you're wanting to search for or bring our attention to?
Yeah, there's a lot of nice just general grassland plants that are quite common in some other areas, but they're quite rare in County Down. So there's a plant called field scabious, which has big purple, sort of bluish purple flowers, which I just think is a really nice meadow plant, and it also has some interesting fungi that grow on it that infect the flowers and spread through pollinators. So it would be interesting to see that as well. And there's a parasitic plant. This is, I think, the only site in County Down now for it, called dodder, which looks a bit like strawberry laces, and it starts off as a seed and doesn't have any chlorophyll, so it has to grow and latch on to another plant, and it forms structures called hostoria that steal nutrients from the other plant.
Interesting.
And then it loses its root system altogether and just grows on the plant and steals
like
steals
a parasite.
Nutrients. Yeah. So it's a hollow
so
parasite because it doesn't even have chlorophyll, so it gets all of its energy from the other plant. Yeah.
Wow. Does it kill the plant eventually?
I think it maybe can for smaller plants, but usually it's only an annual, so
it coexists with that plant.
Yeah, so it weakens it a bit, but it will usually spread over like a large patch of lots of different plants and steal a bit from everything.
Cool.
And
sorry. Go for it.
Well, and then at the end of the year it dies, so then yeah. But I suppose it makes seeds to then come back the next year and start the whole process again.
Is there anything interesting you found in your work over the past few months?
Well, yeah. So I mean, while I'm eating my lunch, I often get distracted by plant pathogens, which are my recent interest. So I've been finding lots of interesting fungi, and there's a group of things that look a bit like fungi called oomycetes, which both of them infect plants, and they form all these interesting structures on the plants, and they're so diverse. I mean, they're as or more diverse than the plants themselves. and a lot of them are much rarer as well. So yeah, I find them really interesting.
Are you hoping to study the fungi a bit more on these plants?
Yeah, I think it would be nice to keep recording them, so I want to kind of get a better idea of which species are in Ireland, because that's not really well understood. Okay. It's been quite easy to find 20 more new species to Ireland, just kind of casually recording this year. So I think there definitely needs to be more research just on like what is here.
Well, we'll take a look and try and find these plants you mentioned, definitely.
So we're here in Killard in a dry, species-rich grassland. So the plant biodiversity here is very high, mostly because of the nutrient-poor soil, which means grasses aren't particularly dominant here, and there's lots of other plants that can make their way up through the sward. So we've got things like lots of clovers and wild carrot and rest harrow, yellow rattle. There's a horsetail, there's some kidney vetch, there's all sorts of things. And all this is quite dependent on how the grassland is managed. So here it's grazed by cattle, but there's no input of fertilizer or any kind of pesticide or herbicide. And that keeps the cattle remove biomass. So they, like in the spring, there's light for things to grow up again, but they don't introduce any more nutrients that would lead to grasses dominating. So that's quite a stark contrast between here and the wider countryside, where a lot of nitrate fertilizer has been added, and that's led to grasses dominating. And there's also broad spectrum herbicides used, which kill things which aren't grasses, essentially. So this is kind of a hidden gem of this is a particularly nice grassland, to be fair, but at some point in the past, this kind of grassland, or grasslands almost nice as this, would have been extremely common throughout the countryside. So it's almost a step back in time. I love these seed heads of wild carrot that curl in on themselves. Make quite a nice texture.
Is it real carrot?
Yeah, so this is the wild ancestor of domesticated carrots. So it does have a taproot, but it's quite thin and stringy. It's not something you'd want to eat. But if you crush the root, it does smell really strongly of carrots. Mm-hmm. So I guess at some point people decided that was good enough to be worth growing in a garden, and then over time they selected it to be less bad.
And put it on your kitchen table.
Yeah. It's hard to tell sometimes if something is something or if it's actually nothing. Oh no, this is it. Yeah.
What is it?
That is a fungus called Enteloma matricarii, and this is the only site in Ireland for it so far.
That little yellow thing on the end, or the
whitish
thing?
Yeah. So it basically just fills the leaf up with its own spores, and then when the leaf dies, they spread.
How did you even spot that among all that?
I knew to look for it because I found it here before.
Oh, okay.
That's the Enteloma again. It's a more obvious one. You can see how there's lots of little spots that are infected and they're sort of slightly swollen. And they'll just burst open with spores.
And infect it more?
Yeah, infect the same plant again or infect other plants.
What plant is this that it's on?
This is called sea mayweed. It's in the daisy family.
Oh yes.
Yeah. It's quite a common one on the shore, rocky shore, all around Ireland really.
Go for it.
It infects the whole plant of sea mayweed again, but you can only see the symptoms in the flowers, and it forms this greyish down on the the ray florets, which are the sort of, they look like petals, but actually this is a whole head of flowers. They're really tiny, so the little yellow ones are disc florets, and then these white ones are ray florets. So it forms conidiophores, which are the tree-like structures again, on the ray florets, and then when a pollinator comes and lands on the flower, it'll pick up some of the spores, which in the peronospora, which grow on flowers, they're sticky. Usually they aren't sticky, but these ones have evolved to be sticky, so they stick to bees and flies and things. And then when they go to another plant, they'll get stuck to the flowers of that and infect that plant as well.
And what did you call this? A peronospora?
Yeah, this is Peronospora radii. So it's one of they're called the floriculous downy mildews, which means downy mildews that grow on flowers. I find them really interesting because they're very well adapted and specialized to grow throughout the whole plant but not cause any symptoms, and then only in the flowers do they cause any visible symptoms, which is a really efficient use of resources because they've kind of solved the same evolutionary problem that flowering plants have. So the ancestors of flowering plants were wind pollinated, but you have to produce a lot more pollen to make enough that it gets spread to other plants. And similarly, peronospora that grow on leaves are spread by the wind, so you have to make a lot more spores for one to have a chance of landing on another plant. But if you are spread by animals, you don't need to produce nearly as many spores to spread to the same number of new plants. So it allows them to use resources much more effectively. And by hijacking the flowering plants' existing adaptations, they've kind of solved the same problem again, which is quite interesting.
Cool.
This is one of my favourite plants that's quite rare in County Down, field scabious. It has these lovely purple flowers. You only really get it in sort of dryish grasslands, which we don't have very many of in County Down. This is not quite the only site, but almost the only site. This one's going over a bit.
Is this field scabious as well?
Yeah, this one's a bit sad looking. I think it's a bit blighted by aphids and things. So this is field scabious again, but this one is infected by a fungus called Microbotrium. I actually can't remember which one this is, but it's a Microbotrium, which are smut fungi, which comes from an old word for dirt. So they infect the whole plant again, a bit like the peronospora that infect the flowers of sea mayweed, but they form, instead of forming little conidiophores, they alter the development of the anthers, which are the parts of the flower that produce pollen, so that instead of producing pollen, they produce spores of the fungus. And then when pollinators visit the flowers, they pick up those spores and transfer them to other plants. So they're one of the more obvious and recognizable groups of plant pathogens, just because they affect the structure of the flowers so much.
Is this the same as the one we saw on the cliffs?
It's the same field scabious, yeah.
Okay.
You can see a little bit of the spores coming out there actually. Sort of beige coloured. So this plant is eyebright. It's one of my favourite plants just because it looks really nice, but it's also interesting because it's a hemi-parasite. So although it has chlorophyll in its leaves, so it does produce sugar using energy from the sun, it also steals nutrients. So it steals water and it steals nitrates from the roots of other plants. So down in the root system, it forms haustoria, which are modified roots that tap in and penetrate the vascular system of the roots of other species, often grasses, but honestly just whatever it finds that isn't resistant to it. And then it has its stomata in its leaves just open, fully open all the time. So it lets out all the water that it can, and that kind of turns into a big sponge, so it can suck up the sap from the vasculature of other plants, and take their nutrients more effectively. This is red Bartzia, so this is another hemi-parasitic plant, and a bit like eyebright, it likes to grow in slightly disturbed ground along these paths. Yeah, and I think this one is infected with a downy mildew. It's on the undersides of the leaves. You can see a slight whitishness, which I'm pretty sure is Plasmapara euphrasii, but I will check under the hand lens. Yeah.
You think it is?
Yeah, even in the sun you can see. It's these little, so it's related to the Peronospores, so it's these little sort of tree-like structures, and they have spores at the end, and it makes the leaves sort of slightly sad looking and sort of curving down. So this is a plant called quaking grass, and it's quite rare in County Down because it likes more basic soils with a higher pH, which we don't have much of. But here at Killard, because it's quite an unusual soil, there's quite a lot of it in this sort of dry grassland. It's one of my favourite grasses, mostly because I don't see it very often, but also because of how it sort of quivers in the wind, which is where it gets its name from. And it's also a good sign of nice, neutral or basic grassland. Like if you see it, you know you're going to see something else interesting. So this is an orchid called Autumn Lady's Tresses, which was discovered here last summer. My mum found it when we were here for a walk. And it has, Lady's Tresses orchids have this distinctive spiral to the flower spike, like a helix, I guess. Yeah, it's getting a bit late in the year for them, but you can still see it has these little white flowers, which, although they're very small, are quite distinctively orchid-like. And in the summer, all that you can see of these orchids is the flower stem, and then in the winter they have a little rosette of leaves that lies flat on the ground. So since the grazing regime here was only changed recently, it could be that they hadn't flowered in decades, and so no one would have ever noticed the rosettes growing flat on the ground in the middle of winter, because it's not really the time when people visit here. One of the things that really surprised me when my mum and I found the orchid was how distant this site is from any of the other known sites. So there are some old records from the Isle of Man, which are the closest to here, and there's also a few colonies in County Dublin, and those would be the nearest. So it's really, really quite far away, at least 50 miles, I think, from the nearest other site. And it's one of the things that makes Killard really special. So we have this Autumn Lady's Tresses, and we also have the only site in Ulster, as far as I know, for another orchid called Green-Winged Orchid. And it's also one of the only sites in the county for dodder, the parasitic plant. It's just full of all these really uncommon species. Yeah, I think a big part of it is just that it has quite unusual geology. So there's lots of things that, like the soil here, where this kind of soil is not very widespread in County Down. And also being so close to the sea, I suppose it doesn't get as severe frosts. So autumn lady's tresses and green-winged orchid are both quite common a good bit further south. So in the far south of Ireland and in the south of England and France, they wouldn't be considered rare at all. But up here, we're sort of approaching the northern edge of their global range. So they're going to be really limited by cold. So to have a really mild coastal site like this means that they can have a sort of northerly outpost.
So how would you round that up today? Was it successful for you?
Yeah, I think we saw pretty much everything we came here to see. We saw the autumn lady's tresses, which is one of the best plants at the site. And we saw some of the interesting fungi that are only known to be here and maybe in a few other places in Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, I learned far more than I thought I would, and I think I have been overloaded with knowledge and plant names.
Yeah, yeah.
But this is like everyday life for you a little bit.
Well, I guess, yeah. It's a fun hobby to have because no matter where you go, there's always something to look at. Particularly with the pathogens now, like I'd started to get bored of some of the more mundane plant species, but then you realise that they all have 2 or 3 or 4 different pathogens that infect them, and yeah. I think one of the best things about today was just being in such a nice habitat.
Yeah.
So not even just that the plants themselves are nice, but seeing so many species in such a small area is always something quite special.
Yeah, I definitely had a great time.
Me too.
Right.